welcome back everyone. Again, Dr. James Broomall, joined today by Matt Borders. And I should thank Matt very much for his time today. We deeply appreciate his knowledge and volunteering that knowledge to the audience and sharing it with us. One of the things I think is so compelling about Civil War era battlefields is that often they're layered landscapes. And we are immersed in the midst of a very layered landscape that goes back to the 18th century. And so on that theme, then Matt's going to introduce some of the concepts relating to the history of enslaved peoples in this area and how this area has changed agriculturally over the years. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt, and I'm going to stay by your side.
Great, thank you, Jim. Welcome everyone to Best Farm. Known as Best Farm for its Civil War time period, this plantation was actually originally known as La Hermitage. It was settled by a French refugee family in 1793. What's going to happen is that the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution specifically. So we have a vast enslaved population in Haiti in the 1790s that would rebel. It's going to become the first successful democracy, or first successful government of a African and Caribbean enslaved peoples down there in Haiti. They are going to drive out most, if not all, of the white population. 31,000 some odd people are going to be forced to flee from Haiti. Half of the Vincentiaire family would flee to South Carolina. The other half flees back to France. In fact, half of the family, or a good portion of the family, was already in France just in time for the French Revolution to break out. That portion of the family, the portion that we'll be talking about today, will then flee across the Atlantic Ocean to Baltimore. We actually do not know if the portion of the family that first went to South Carolina and those that were in France and later fled to Baltimore ever reconnected. We think there might have been some connection by letters, but physically we don't believe the family ever came back together. The Vincentiaires that come out here to central Maryland in 1793, they had fled, at this point, 2 revolutions. They had had some ties to French royalists, and so they definitely needed to get out of France before the Reign of Terror began. They are a slave-owning family who we believe was then trying to replicate their former plantation society that they had in Haiti right here in central Maryland. To do that, they are going to build a fairly large house. Just behind you is Best House. It actually has multiple layers to it. The oldest section of the house is right over here. You can see, if you look at the structure, how the windows actually change. And these are 2 different eras of the building of the exterior of the building. The initial rooms, large windows, big open rooms, very airy, very similar to Caribbean architecture. But they very quickly found out that it gets cold here in Maryland in the winters, and so the next section of the house, smaller windows, smaller rooms, and as later generations would build onto this structure, it's interesting that the rooms and the windows get smaller and smaller as you go back along the house. Now, back behind us here, where Jim and I started, this open hill, this is actually where the enslaved population of La Hermitage lived. We're going to have a series of 6 structures out here on this little hill between what is today Route 35 and where we're standing, 355 and where we're standing. This little hill had 6 basically dormitories, or big old buildings holding multiple families. It did have some sort of fence surrounding it, and it is our belief that this series of structures was built on the property with defense in mind. Okay, this family here, the Vincentiaires, have gone through a significant trauma. They don't trust their enslaved population. Makes sense. They have them out front where everyone can see them. Anyone moving down the roads could see this population. They have the overseer's house between the enslaved population and the main house, and then the main house is up here on this hill.
And I'm going to pause you quickly because I'm going to say this is really unusual, right? I
Mhm.
mean, when we think about the landscape architecture of the American South,
Right.
traditionally enslaved quarters are located well behind the main house.
Exactly.
And the intermediary structure is the overseer's house in the back portions, whereas in this instance, it's sort of full on display. And so this is extremely unusual in many instances.
Exactly right, Jim. This is extremely unusual, and it is going to, we will see those traditional architecture styles of putting the enslaved in the back and things like that on our other farms. But this one here, we really think they were trying to keep an eye on their enslaved population and build their home defensively. Victoire Vincendière, the oldest daughter of the family that moves out here, of the Vincendière family, she will actually be the head of household, on paper at least. Now, we think the gentleman who had helped the family move out here was probably the driving force behind much of the land acquisition that would occur. Eventually, 748 acres would make up what is now known as Best Farm. Much smaller than that today, 200 some that the Park Service has. But 748 acres stretched north towards Frederick, all the way up to where the current FSK Mall is currently. Upwards to 90 enslaved individuals were on this property. The Vincendières were known to have the second largest enslaved population in the state of Maryland at that time, in the 1790s, to about 1,800. Victoire, she is going to also purchase land and housing in Frederick. There seems to be some suggestion that Victoire and her sisters were not as interested in rebuilding and continuing to operate this plantation society that their parents had had, and they were more interested in moving into Frederick, into the burgeoning social life of Frederick City. And we would begin to see the enslaved population drop precipitously from about 1810 to about 1830. Okay. By 1827, the home is no longer, and the Hermitage is no longer within the Vincendière family. Payen, the original gentleman who had been, again, probably the driving force behind a lot of these acquisitions, he has passed away by that point. Victoire's mother, who I'm suddenly blanking on her name, she has also passed away by this point. And it's the daughters who have now taken over the land holdings here in its entirety. And they're going to begin to divest themselves of property. Unfortunately, much of that is enslaved property as well, and land. By 1850, we would have the family that would become best known for this property, the Best family, begins to rent out this property here. Continuing with our focus here at Best Farm, the Best family, specifically John Best, would be farming here on the property into the 1850s, and he is going to turn his property over to his son, David Best, and his wife. Now, they will be the folks that are here, John Best and his wife are here. David Best was his father. They will be the ones that will be here during the Battle of Monocacy on July 9th, 1864. Now, looking across the landscape here, we actually are looking towards Frederick to the north of us. Confederate forces are moving southward down 355, the old Georgetown Turnpike. The reason for this is actually they had run into Federal resistance about 2.5 miles to the north of us from here along what is today Route 144, the Baltimore Pike, at around 6 a.m. Those Confederate soldiers had been moving towards the crossing over the Monocacy River at Jug Bridge. They ran into Ohio National Guardsmen, some of these 100 Days men we were talking about. And those Ohio boys, they put up a pretty good fight. So much so that the Confederates are going to shift down here to the Georgetown Pike and the more direct route to Washington, D.C. It's important to keep in mind, the Confederates are not looking for a fight here. Jubal Early is not looking for a battle. He is trying to get to Washington, D.C. as quickly as possible. And so when they ran into that resistance to the north, they just shifted down here to this road in hopes of pressing on. But they will run into even more Federal resistance here around Best Farm, and more specifically, the two crossing points over the Monocacy. The wooden covered bridge over the Monocacy River on the road, and the iron railroad bridge for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Those two bridges will be guarded by federal forces under Lew Wallace. We've already mentioned that the majority of Wallace's command is actually on the south side of the Monocacy, on the high ground, overlooking all these fields behind me here. However, there was a thin line of federal troops, about 300 skirmishers, out here amongst the fields of the Best Farm. These 300 skirmishers will receive the Confederate advance as they are pushing south out of Frederick. They begin deploying and utilizing all of this high ground we see here to the north of me. You can see that thick tree line out there. That was not there in 1864. That's helping to block a visual impediment on the edge of the battlefield. But this rising ground, all of these little knolls, would be utilized by Confederate forces, and more specifically, Confederate artillery during the battle. Stephen Dotson Ramseur is very concerned about what he sees in front of him. A lot of open, rolling landscape with federal troops overlooking him to the south with their limited but rifled artillery. He, instead of deciding to deploy in large lines of battles, these big classic formations, he instead will push forward his artillery, his own artillery, his sharpshooters, and of course skirmishers to try to clear out this federal skirmish line and move towards the bridges. He doesn't want to give the Federals a big old target with his battle lines, and so he's moving forward with this small units. And this Confederate pressure would work over the course of the morning. They're going to begin driving back Federal skirmishers. In fact, the skirmish line was initially commanded by a Captain Brown of the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. He would very quickly realize that he is out of his depth and turn the command of this skirmish line over to George Davis, Lieutenant George Davis of the 10th Vermont Infantry. And keep Davis in mind because we're going to hear about him more later. But as the morning continues, Confederate skirmishers and sharpshooters will succeed in driving back the Federal line here, again only about 300 men, to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad directly behind you. The railroad was there in 1864. It was an active railroad, and so the railroad grade is there, and they're going to use that cut, that grade, as a trench to help hold those two bridges for as long as possible. Right here on the Best property, there was a barn out right here in 1864. That barn would be sacrificed to the battle. Confederate sharpshooters get up into it. They actually are going to apparently peel off some of the shingles of the roof and begin firing out of those holes at Federal gunners to the south of us. The gunners actually commented after the battle about how they couldn't figure out where the fire was coming from for quite some time, until eventually one of their officers saw puffs of smoke coming out from underneath the shingles. At which point, Union guns would be trained on that barn, and it would be hit multiple times. One of those gunners later writing that the 3rd and 4th shot struck within the barn, and soon the structure was ablaze. And we had the pleasure of seeing many of them, meaning the sharpshooters, being carried away on a litter. So this would be a very effective fire. The barn would burn down entirely right here during the Battle of Monocacy. While all this has been going on, all of this preliminary skirmishing and artillery fire, pushing back these Federal skirmishers to the railroad line, where's Jubal Early? Because he's not on the battlefield. He's back in Frederick, ransoming the town. He would demand of the city of Frederick $200,000. In 1864 money, $200,000 today is about $3.5 million. And very understandably, the city of Frederick does not want to pay that. Mayor William Cole has been buying for time throughout the morning, kind of hemming and hawing and trying to figure out how to get the city out of paying this ransom. He'd heard those Union troop trains, those reinforcements of veteran soldiers coming in throughout the night of July 8th and into the early morning hours of the 9th. He knows that Wallace has been reinforced. Maybe if the Federals can win here, maybe if the United States Army can win here, the city won't have to pay. And so he's been buying for time, trying to hope that that will happen. And this is going to frustrate Early a lot. In fact, by around 11:30, 12 o'clock in the afternoon, Early is going to become so frustrated with the situation that he will turn negotiations over to his staff officers, and he comes out here to the battlefield to find out why his forces are being stymied by what was supposed to be just militia. Now, his staff officers would eventually negotiate for this $200,000 with the transfer happening late that afternoon around 4 p.m. And the story goes that when they got the money, that they had it delivered to them in large wicker baskets, at which point they went on a bit of a spree in Frederick, buying up a late lunch. They got some champagne with that lunch, even a little ice cream to finish off the meal. So some delicacies they hadn't seen in a while. But by the time Early made it out here to the battlefield, just a little south of Frederick City, the Confederate commanders on the ground are already beginning to look at other options. The resistance here at the bridges is taking too long. And so Confederate cavalry under John McCausland has been sent out to the west, about a mile down the Monocacy River. He will find yet another crossing point, a ford, a natural low spot with a hard bottom that will allow the Confederate Cavaliers to get across the Monocacy. Now that ford is guarded. Company B, 8th Illinois Cavalry, does guard that ford, but there's 1,200 Confederates against this understrength company, and they're very quickly dispersed. John McCausland's cavalry would succeed in getting up onto the Worthington Plateau, up by Worthington House, and that's where we're going to pick up the story in just a few minutes.